Hello from COP25, the UN Climate Conference here in Madrid. I'm Shireen Wheeler from the European Investment Bank. Now here at COP25, academics, think tanks, government representatives and financiers have been gathering to debate and discuss how to get to those key goals that are underlined in the Paris Agreement, how to stay below 1.5 degrees on global temperatures. That is at the core of the agreement. And to discuss how public institutions like the EIB can help contribute to that, I'm happy to be joined by the EIB's Chief Climate Change expert, Nancy Saich. Nancy, hi.
Hi, Shireen.
Now, since we were last here at the COP, that was in Katowice, what has actually happened? What's the EIB done to contribute to the Paris goals?
Well, we left Katowice talking about 1.5 degrees and about a just transition.
Yeah.
And I think that work and those focuses have continued. But there's been an enormous amount happening this year. We've had the IPCC 1.5 degrees reports on oceans and the cryosphere and on climate and land. Terribly important scientific information which financiers and others have to take into account. And we at the bank have stepped forward as the EU Climate Bank, and we have now laid out and approved by our board two important things. One, that we will be in our Climate Bank roadmap aligning all our financing activities with the goals and objectives of the Paris Agreement. That's a huge task, and we're going to do that. We're going to put everything in place by the end of next year, by the end of 2020. As well as that, we have committed to increasing our climate action and environment sustainability financing, which some people might call green, to 50% of our overall global financing by 2025. So that's a big step up in that financing for the things that really address climate and environmental problems. And as we know, this is a dual emergency, climate and environment emergency.
Now, we also committed to exiting out of fossil fuels.
Yes, so the first big step of that has been our energy lending policy. And that was publicly consulted this year and was also approved by the board in November. Big step forward for us. We have brought our emissions performance standard down to 250 grams per kilowatt hour. Sounds a bit technical, but what it means is that no new project can come to the bank now unless it's really a low emitting power project, and effectively unless it's unabated, all fossil fuel power would be out.
Now, we've talked a lot about, you mentioned about green finance, 50% will be dedicated to those kind of climate action and environmental projects. How do we make sure that when we say green, it really means green?
Well, that brings me to another thing we've all been very busy on at the bank. The sector experts and the climate team have been supporting the EU Technical Expert Group on their taxonomy work.
Now you have to tell viewers who are watching what taxonomy is.
Okay, the taxonomy, the EU taxonomy for environmentally sustainable activities, it's a long title, is basically about making a list of what things can be counted in the future as green, because they will be making a substantial contribution to addressing climate change. And in the future, there will be the same work done for biodiversity, depollution, and so on. But we've been helping with the work on climate change, adaptation, and mitigation.
So if I can call it a common rule book for green finance, and of course we know that that's pretty close to agreement now. But what about the other stuff? What about the other things that don't really count as green finance? How do we make sure, for example, in the EIB, that we're not on the one hand doing green and on the other actually contributing to climate change?
That's actually really what Paris alignment is about when we say, as the EU Climate Bank, that we're going to align our financing activities with the goals. It means all of our finance, loans, guarantees, everything. We have to make sure that everything we're doing is compatible with a 1.5 degrees scenario and is also, at the same time, supporting climate resilience. And I would like to bring in the social angle, because we are well aware, as we were last year in Katowice, that this has to be inclusive. We have to look at whether or we are really taking account of the social impacts of these measures, both measures to address climate change, like, for example, changing the way we support power projects and going to a big increase in renewable energy, or whether it's about adaptation and countries that are very vulnerable to climate change. So it's really about looking at the whole thing and making sure that everything we're doing is supporting this trajectory, which isn't optional. I just was in the meeting here and I heard a very good colleague from FMO, the Dutch bank, talking about the fact that at the moment a lot of the discussion is about how fast we're driving off the cliff of climate change. Well, how fast doesn't matter. What matters is that we don't go over the edge, and that's what 1.5 degrees is about.
Now, we've been talking about what the EIB did, what the EIB is going to do, but actually, even though it's a big bank, the biggest multilateral development bank, it's not going to do it on its own, is it?
No, absolutely not. There's a number of ways that we're working with others. I just came out of a meeting where we're working together with the Dutch and Swiss governments on an initiative to really encourage robust reporting on alignment of financial flows. I think that's really important. We don't want Paris washing as a new version of the problem of greenwashing. But we're also working with other MDBs, and we also work with commercial banks and regional banks. And for example, we've been working for a number of years with the Caribbean Development Bank. And this is really with a focus on adaptation and climate resilience in one of the regions which is really already being hard hit by climate change with not only sea level rise but a massive increase in severity and frequency of hurricanes. So we've been working with the Caribbean Development Bank and we've been learning together, two institutions, and that's what partnership's about, supporting those countries in making sure their projects are resilient, but also making sure that they plan this kind of climate resilience into what they're doing for the future. Yeah. And that's really important. And I had a privilege once to go to St. Lucia to visit one of the projects. It was a water reservoir which had lost a third of its volume through collapsing slopes. And it was really, really important to hear from the water authority and from the government there how important what we were doing was and how it really affects the people in St. Lucia who don't have a reliable water supply.
But I mean, going back a minute, the emphasis here at COP25 obviously has been around how to lower emissions. So these are projects that we call mitigation projects that help sort of reduce global temperatures. But this issue that you're talking about here is about the impacts of climate change, isn't it?
Yes.
It's about adaptation. Now that seems to be getting more and more of an issue. But I mean, isn't that slightly missing the point? Just to put the devil's advocate point of view, shouldn't we be focusing on lowering temperatures?
Well, we absolutely must not take our foot off the pedal of climate change mitigation and dealing with the temperature crisis. If we can go back to the car analogy, I suppose it would be like having a car which was resilient to more extreme heat. It doesn't really matter if you're going off the edge of the cliff. But we must deal with the impacts on people and livelihoods. So we have to do both at the same time.
And is the EIB planning to do more on adaptation? Because this is a difficult area. I mean, it's hard to get private finance on board. It's hard to convince investors that there are returns. I mean, everyone knows wind energy, solar energy, that's a pretty much of a no-brainer. But what about this area?
It is difficult. Sometimes a lot of the investments might be in public areas, public investment, and perhaps in developing countries they don't have the financial means and we have to look at concessional finance. But we also in many areas have to look at bringing the private sector in. I was in a meeting about resilience yesterday where they were talking about the enormous amount of private finance that's going into non-resilient investments. This is really not a good investment in the world of more extreme weather. And the bank has therefore said in its new ambition, and it's part of our Climate Bank roadmap, that we will be absolutely stepping up finance for adaptation. But it's not easy because you do need to work with your clients and understand their vulnerability to climate change and how we can best help them.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Nancy, for steering us through these big issues. That's all from me and Nancy for the moment. Bye for now.
Bye.